Hey everybody, we're going to take a few minutes today and let me introduce to you a good friend. This is Julie Homrich, and I have fallen in love with her work. She is a licensed professional counselor here in Sugar Hill and has become really an extended part of our family. Sugar Hill Church, this is a really bright human being who has come to help give us some perspective on what it is to be overwhelmed. We're in week 3 of overwhelm. So Julie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm going to jump right in. So we all are dealing with overwhelm to some degree, especially in the world we live in today. Mm-hmm. And I fear at times the church treats people in overwhelm and people that have legitimate and challenging feelings. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we pull the pin on a Bible verse hand grenade, lob it at them, it explodes, and you're supposed to be okay. Mm-hmm. Or we say things that mean well, but we say things like, hey, just give it to God. Mm-hmm. And I mean, even as a pastor, I think to myself, what in the world does that mean, to give it to God, you know? Yeah. So I believe with all my heart, and the more I talk with you, the more I believe it, that feelings God allows to happen in our life for a purpose and a reason. They're kind of red flags that say hello, and we don't run from them, and we shouldn't have to fear them. So with all that happening, give us some things that you'd say any person at whatever degree they're at in overwhelm, they probably ought to consider moving forward with these thoughts. So just kind of take it from there and give us some of that perspective from a licensed professional counselor.
Sure. So I think that understanding the purpose of emotions is so crucial in being able to identify and handle overwhelm.
Yeah.
You know, I have clients who come into the office and they are completely overcome with emotion. Yeah. And they ask me, what is even the purpose of all of these feelings? Why did God give me feelings? Why did he give me emotions? And I think there are a number of different reasons why we have them. I mean, God gave us an entire array of feelings. So like you said, it's important not to avoid them or ignore them. Yeah. But one thing that I think is really important for us in identifying overwhelm is recognizing that our feelings are messengers.
Wow.
So they're there to tell us something. They are there to teach us something. And so if we are feeling overwhelmed, it might be a message to us to stop, really pay attention to that, and consider if perhaps a change is needed.
So in some ways, that messenger is unique to us. It's unique to whatever we're in the middle of. But what I think is wonderful about the perspective is it allows us to kind of own it, knowing it's unique, it's special. But it's not unusual.
Right.
Like we all have these feelings. We need to identify them and know that they're there to give us this, hey, wait a minute. Like in my life, often the messenger says, Chuck, you are out of the center of what you're really created for. You're functioning over here, so you're not going to see it clearly till you get back. And I see that a lot with people that come into my office. And then they just kind of layer on top of it, and before you know it, they don't even know why they're overwhelmed.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so wise, as you were talking about, you know, integrating the spirituality into it instead of just kind of, you know, throwing a Bible verse on there. Because if people don't know where they start and where their emotions are, they're not going to necessarily know how to integrate that into their spiritual life.
Yeah. So I've also heard that you have a few exercises that you ask your clients to work through. And even the other day when we were chatting, I went home and my wife and I were thinking, wow, this is really good because this is something anybody can do anywhere. So what are some of those thoughts?
Yeah, so a practical exercise that I like to utilize with my clients when they're experiencing overwhelm or high stress is I encourage them to kind of go home, take a moment, and maybe write down all of the times in that particular day or in that week that they have used the words, I should.
Wow.
So they're going to write down, I should do this, I should feel this, I should say this. All of these things and expectations that they feel they put on themselves or others have put on them. And then I encourage them to replace those words, I should, with I choose to.
Oh, wow. Okay, we could talk an hour on that, and we probably will at some point. Yes. But it does bring up the point that this exercise, I should and I choose, is kind of at the heart of many overwhelmed people. in the thought that I would be willing to say 100% of the times that I find myself overwhelmed, if I trace it back to its root, it's usually a choice I made or continuing choices that have layered up and become a problem.
Right, right. And God does give us the ability to choose. And when we recognize, like you just did, that if we have the ability to choose, then we also have the ability to find our way out of situations.
Wow.
If we recognize that.
I love that. I can choose to stay or get there, but I equally have a free will to choose to come out of it.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
that's so good.
Yeah, it helps with that feeling of powerlessness that I think.
Is it, as a preacher, I love to say, but you have to capture it. It's not enough just to think it. There is something powerful in those 12 inches while you're writing between here and here.
Right, right. And when you write something down, you're actually strengthening the neural pathway in your brain. So the more you do it, the more it kind of internalizes into your thought processes.
I told you she was smart.
Writing down helps.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got that exercise. What else would you suggest?
So I think another thing that could help, I encourage my clients a lot when they're feeling overwhelmed to reach out to other people.
Are you about to preach?
No, I'll leave that to you.
Okay.
But I think that God did actually not create our bodies to do overwhelm alone.
Absolutely.
And here's why. I think this is so fascinating. So when we're feeling stressed out, or we're feeling anxiety, or we're feeling overwhelmed, our bodies respond, and they respond by producing a number of hormones and chemicals. They produce adrenaline, they produce cortisol. Those are the things that lead us into action.
Right.
However, our bodies also produce a hormone called oxytocin when we're stressed out.
I have no idea what that is.
So in the scientific community, they call oxytocin the bonding hormone.
As in people to people?
Connected.
Okay, got it.
Yes. Yeah. Some people call it the cuddle hormone.
Yeah.
It's also something that mothers, when they're nurturing their babies, oxytocin is released. When we're hugging somebody else, oxytocin is released. It's also released when we're stressed.
Oh, wow. So when we're stressed, our body is literally creating at a molecular level, saying, you need help.
You need to reach out. You need to bond. You need to connect.
The big difference between I need help and actually seeking it, though, because that's a choice, right?
Absolutely. And I hear that a lot in my office when, clients will come in and I'll encourage them to reach out and ask for help. And the thing I hear a lot is I don't want to burden anybody.
Yeah, I hear that a ton.
I don't want to put my troubles on somebody else because I want to carry them. I don't want anyone else to have to carry them. Which is
the fastest way to stay overwhelmed.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what's really interesting about this is that when we look at this from kind of a scientific perspective, researchers have found that the individuals receiving the support when they ask for help, they are not the only ones that are benefiting from this on a biological level.
So it's really happening in the person that provides the help almost equally.
Yes, and there is some data and science to back that up.
Okay, so you told me about a study at Stanford, which is world-renowned educational institute.
Right.
So can you briefly give us I think it's important you get this picture.
Yeah, so at Stanford University, they were studying stress and overwhelm over a long period of time. They identified a number of different groups of people who had either identified themselves as having high stress in their life, moderate stress, or low stress. They followed them for about 8 years, and then they checked in to see how this stress and overwhelm was affecting them on a physiological level in their bodies and in their health.
Because this stress, anxiety, overwhelm, whatever you call it, is science has proven overwhelmingly that this is not just a feeling that you get over.
Right. And actually, the group that had the highest level of stress, they were separated into 2 subgroups.
Okay.
And there was one subgroup, and they actually did not engage in any kind of extra helping behaviors or anything like we're talking about in reaching out. And they did have a lot of those physiological effects of stress.
So like when you say physiological, I mean, we're talking about serious health concerns.
Cardiovascular issues. They actually had a 40% higher chance of dying than those in the lower stress
Time
groups.
out. A 40% greater death rate because of anxiety, stress, overwhelm.
Right.
That alone would make me say, I need help.
Yes. But the good news is there is another option for that.
Yeah.
So that group, the second group that they that they kind of checked back in with. This group had the same high level of stress in their life. However, you would expect to see the same kind of physical responses. They didn't have any of that. This is a group that identified themselves as people who were the helpers. They were the people that cared for those who were reaching out to them. They were the ones serving.
That is fascinating.
And they didn't have those same health effects. As a matter of fact, they actually had greater or better health effects than all of the groups combined.
Wow.
Even the ones who had relatively little stress to begin with.
Wow. So like when we encourage people to pack 500,000 meals, bring your used shoes, help pack backpacks, all those kind of things, you're literally taking one choice to move toward overcoming overwhelm.
Yes, it has a protective effect of the stress on your body.
That is a great term, a protective effect. One of the things, Julie, that you taught me was a phrase I'd never heard before called spiritual bypassing. Now, when I heard it, I mean, honestly, as a pastor, I thought, okay, that doesn't sound good, you know? But explain to us what you mean by spiritual bypass, because as believers, I think often we feel like we're always supposed to have an answer for people, whether it's grief or illness or finances, whatever it is, we feel like we're supposed to have an answer. And oftentimes, unintentionally, we weaponize Scripture or the name of God and might create more damage than good. So help us understand spiritual bypassing.
Yeah, so spiritual bypassing at the core is bypassing our normal and natural human emotion by immediately attaching some kind of spiritual meaning to it with the oftentimes unconscious attempt to distance ourselves from those uncomfortable feelings.
Right. So in other words, like, well, you just need to pray more. You just need to read more Bible.
Right.
Yeah.
It's difficult for us in general as a culture to really sit in these difficult emotions because we don't know what to do with them.
Nobody likes it. Yeah.
Right. And so if we can just say, well, God works all things for the good, or here's what you need to do, then we feel like we've done something, but the person who's in pain might feel invalidated. They might feel like, well, I don't believe enough because this isn't helping me.
So now I've got an additional expectation on me that I'm failing. I'm even failing with God.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think at the core of spiritual bypassing, you know, psychologically, we talk about defense mechanisms. And that's what spiritual bypassing is. We have a defense mechanism when we deny things because we're trying to get that space from that uncomfortable emotion, from the pain, the suffering, whatever it is that we can't put words to or we feel helpless in when we project onto others. So we have an uncomfortable feeling about ourselves. So instead of looking at that and considering it, we project it onto somebody else, again, to create space between us. And
so distancing is kind of at the heart of this.
It's at the heart of spiritual bypassing as well, yes.
Wow. You know, we say a lot around here that from a distance, everything is simple. The closer you get to the situation, the more complex it becomes. So when we're living with it, it is highly, it is, the complexity is just overwhelming.
Right.
Hence the term. But when you try to distance, the problem's still there.
Right.
But you literally just think, okay, why can't I cope with that?
Right. And you can feel increasingly alone in your pain.
Yeah.
And that's where spiritual bypassing can be really harmful unintentionally to people, because really at the core, if we're trying to integrate our emotions and our spirituality, you know, Jesus entered into those difficult places. He entered into our feelings, sometimes just to be with us and just to connect with us in it. So when we do the spiritual bypassing, we're actually not getting the intended result that we wanted from the beginning, because all of those things are true. It is true that God works all things for the good. Right. But when somebody is in that place of pain and we don't know how to handle it, so we try to distance them from that emotion.
It just hit me, Julie, that this feels like a technical term, but it feels highly personal from a spiritual perspective. Jesus says that we're to abide in Him, but you can't abide in distance at the same time.
Right.
So to bypass the abiding says we're just elongating the stress, the anxiety, and the overwhelming sensation.
Right, because we're body, soul, and spirit.
Wow.
So when we ignore the soul part, when we ignore our emotional response to things, we're disconnecting from ourselves. And if we're disconnected from ourselves, it's hard for us to connect with God and to connect with others.
Oh, that's so good. Julie, when I think about spiritual bypassing, the first thing I think of is the responsibility the church has to ensure that we recognize that by and large the American church has been so guilty of this. Not intentionally, of course, but because we're aware of it now, I think we have a responsibility to ensure that we're not guilty of that, that we know feelings are real, emotions are significant, and the world is filled with it right now. The church has the greatest opportunity in the history of the church to minister to people and love to people in a way like we've never been able to before. Because this isn't about whether somebody gets baptized or not. This isn't about whether somebody prays a sinner's prayer with you or not. This is about God's creation and the opportunity to meet them where they're at and be able to provide real, live, honest goodness, help that we get the benefit from, just like the Stanford study said.
Exactly.
So this is just the beginning. And we want to thank you so much for taking a few minutes to join Julie and myself, knowing that we have some live opportunities and some additional video resources coming so that we're not guilty of being spiritual bypassers, but we're truly trying to learn how do we abide in such a way that we can overcome our overwhelm. Thanks for joining us today. I can't wait to unpack more with you, and I thank you so much for being with us. God bless you guys. Go in peace.